A millionaire laughed at a boy selling sweets outside his five-star restaurant. 3 months later, this same man was on his knees, begging for forgiveness in front of television cameras as his empire crumbled live on air. "Get this kid out of here before I call the police." Richard Castellano, owner of Chicago's most exclusive chain of Italian restaurants, pointed furiously at the 15-year-old boy holding a box of candy at the entrance to Castellano's Prime. "Do you think you can infest my establishment with this walking poverty?" Miguel Torres was just 15 years old and never imagined that selling candy to help his sick mother would end up becoming the catalyst for one of the biggest business downfalls Illinois has ever witnessed. His torn sneakers and faded t-shirt contrasted brutally with the crystal chandeliers and marble tables of the restaurant that dominated the entire corner of Michigan Avenue. The establishment's security guard moved forward, but Miguel remained still, holding his box of homemade sweets with a dignity that seemed disproportionate for someone so young. His brown eyes met Castellanos for a brief moment, not with fear, but with something that the millionaire couldn't completely decipher at that moment. "Sir, I'm just trying to make some honest money," Miguel said, his voice too calm for someone being publicly expelled. "My bullets are made by my mother. She was hospitalized until last week and..." "Admitted?" Castellano laughed loudly, drawing the attention of customers dining on the outdoor patio. "Look, guys, the kid wants us to feel sorry for him. What a touching story." He turned to Miguel again with evident contempt. "You know what I think? I think your mother should have taught you that beggars aren't welcome in real establishments. Now get lost before I actually call the authorities." Customers watched the scene with varying expressions, some embarrassed, others indifferent, some even laughing discreetly at the businessman's cruel comments. Miguel noticed an elderly woman at the second table who looked away, clearly uncomfortable. Beside her, a man in a suit was discreetly photographing everything with his cell phone. Miguel took a deep breath, something shining in his eyes that Castellano interpreted as unshed tears. "I understand, sir. I'll leave." But before turning his back, he added something that made the businessman frown. "My mother always says that every action has a consequence. I hope you never have to learn that the hard way." "Are you threatening me?" Castellano stepped forward, his face red with anger. "You, a miserable candy salesman, are threatening me. Do you know who I am? Do you know how many restaurants I own? How much money I move?" Miguel simply shook his head and started walking down the sidewalk. The security guard followed him for a few meters to make sure he actually moved away. What no one noticed was that Miguel stopped at the next corner, pulled a small notebook from his pocket, and quickly wrote something down, his fingers shaking, but not from fear or embarrassment. Castellano went back into the restaurant, still muttering about the audacity of these people. He greeted some regulars, joked about the incident, asked the waiter to bring champagne for table 6, courtesy of the house, of course. Everything was perfectly normal in their carefully constructed world of privilege and exclusivity. What Richard Castellano didn't know and could never have imagined in that moment of triumphant arrogance was that Miguel Torres was no ordinary boy selling sweets. 3 years earlier, when he was just 12 years old, he had watched his mother, Carmen Torres, get unjustly fired from the same restaurant where she worked as an assistant chef. The accusation, theft of a very expensive bottle of wine that coincidentally disappeared on the same day that she dared to report serious health irregularities in the kitchen. Carmen was never able to prove her innocence. No other high-end restaurants hired her after Castellano spread rumors about her dishonesty among the industry's inner circle. She ended up taking odd jobs, her health deteriorating under the weight of injustice and financial stress, until a heart problem landed her in the hospital 3 weeks ago. Miguel started selling the handmade sweets that his mother made as a hobby, precisely to pay off his growing medical debts. But he didn't choose that restaurant by chance. Over the past 2 months, he had carefully mapped out peak times, identified regular customers, and most importantly, documented every interaction he witnessed. As he walked home that cold October night, Miguel opened his notebook and added one more entry to the growing list. October 3rd, expu I do so publicly. Witnesses, approximately 15 customers, 4 employees. Man in gray suit photographed everything. What the arrogant, cruel millionaire couldn't see beneath his torn sneakers and faded t-shirt was a meticulous strategist who was collecting each piece of a much larger puzzle. A boy who had learned, through his mother's suffering, that justice doesn't come from pleading or tears, but from preparation, patience, and the perfect time to act. While Castellano toasted with champagne that night, celebrating another successful day in his gastronomic empire, Miguel was at home at his mother's bedside, showing her the video that the man in the suit had sent anonymously to her email. Carmen squeezed her son's hand, tears streaming down her face, and whispered something that made Miguel's eyes shine with renewed determination. There, in that small apartment where the electricity bill was late and the refrigerator was almost empty, a revenge began to unfold so perfectly calculated that it would transform the lives of both the humiliated boy and the arrogant businessman in ways that no one could have predicted. If you're enjoying this story of how a simple act of cruelty would turn into the biggest mistake of a millionaire's life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what Miguel was secretly planning at that moment would make Richard Castellano realize too late that underestimating someone for what they wear or where they come from can cost a lot more than just money. In the days following the public humiliation, Miguel continued selling his candy around the neighborhood, but always avoiding the street of Castellanos Prime, not because I was afraid, but because it wasn't the right time to go back. The video of the expulsion began to circulate discreetly on social media. The man in the suit who had photographed everything was James Sullivan, an investigative journalist for the Chicago Tribune, who regularly dined at Castellanos' restaurant. He sent the video to Miguel with a simple message: "If you need help, look for me. This type of behavior deserves to be exposed." Miguel thanked him, but asked that James not publish anything yet. "Trust me," the boy wrote. "When the time is right, you'll have a much bigger story than just an arrogant businessman kicking out a candy seller." Meanwhile, Richard Castellano was at the height of his arrogance. His restaurant chain had just closed $1 million contract to expand to 3 new cities. During an interview with a business magazine, he casually mentioned the incident. "We have to maintain certain standards, you know. We cannot allow anyone to disturb our customers. Elite establishments need elite clientele." The phrase was published and shared by his admirers as an example of excellence in business management. Castellano framed the article and hung it in the restaurant's main hallway, next to his other awards and recognitions. Carmen Torres had been released from the hospital, but her condition remained delicate. The doctors were clear. She needed absolute rest and constant cardiological monitoring, treatments that cost more than the family could pay. Miguel increased his sales journey, waking up at 5 in the morning to make sweets with recipes that Carmen dictated from bed, then going out to sell until nightfall. One afternoon, 3 weeks after the incident, Miguel was selling in front of a coffee shop when he recognized one of the customers who had witnessed his expulsion. It was the elderly lady who had looked away, clearly embarrassed. She recognized him too, and stopped, hesitant. "You're the boy from that Italian restaurant, aren't you?" she asked, her voice thick with guilt. "I'm sorry I didn't say anything that day. I should have." "You have nothing to apologize for," Miguel replied gently. "But can I ask you a question? Are you a regular customer at Castellanos?" The woman nodded. "I am, or rather it was. After that day I never went back. The food may be exceptional, but no dish is worth the company of such cruelty." "Do you remember a chef named Carmen Torres who worked there 3 years ago?" Miguel asked, his voice carefully neutral. The lady's eyes lit up with recognition. "Carmen, of course I remember. She prepared the best risottos I've ever tasted. She suddenly disappeared, and when I asked Mr. Castellano, he said something about her stealing expensive wine. I never believed that story. That woman had integrity in every gesture. She's my mother," Miguel said simply. The lady put her hand to her chest, her eyes wide. "Your son? Oh, darling." She grabbed Miguel's hands urgently. "I need to tell you something. The night before the alleged robbery, I was in the women's bathroom when I heard from the EYE's employees talking about irregularities in the kitchen. One of them said they needed to take care of the assistant chef who was asking too many questions about hygiene procedures. At the time I didn't pay much attention, but now," Miguel pulled out his notebook. "Would you remember any details of that conversation? Anything?" The lady, who introduced herself as Ms. Margaret Chen, spent the next hour reconstructing memories of that night. More importantly, she still had the receipts for all of her restaurant visits, including this specific one, meticulously organized for tax filing purposes. "Keep this safe," she said, handing Miguel copies of the receipts and her contact card. "If you need a witness, you can count on me. I'm too old to be afraid of men like Richard Castellano." That night, Miguel added the information to his notebook, which now contained 3 years of meticulous research. Each page documented disturbing patterns at Castellanos Prime. Employees fired after questioning irregular practices, suppliers threatened when they tried to report expired products being accepted, even cases of food poisoning that were hushed up with financial settlements and legal threats. But collecting evidence was only the first part of the plan. Miguel needed something more, something that turned information into real justice. That's when he remembered something his mother had mentioned years ago, during her last days at the restaurant. "He keeps everything in an office on the 2nd floor, Carmen had said, still shocked by the false accusation. "Questionable contracts, altered documents, even a second set of ledgers. I saw it when I went up there once to deliver papers. Richard doesn't think anyone knows, but that office holds all his dirty secrets. Miguel spent the next few weeks observing the restaurant's standards. He discovered that Castellano personally locked that office every night, but that on Thursdays he left early to play poker with other businessmen in the area. The restaurant was under the responsibility of the night manager, a man named Victor who, according to Miguel's research, had recently been hired after being fired from another establishment for, ironically, reporting illegal labor practices. The following Thursday, Miguel was not selling candy. Instead, wearing more presentable borrowed clothes and carrying a briefcase, he waited until Castellano left and then approached the restaurant's side entrance, where Victor was overseeing the receipt of merchandise. "Excuse me, sir," Miguel said, his voice firm but respectful. "My name is Miguel Torres. I know you don't know me, but I just need 5 minutes to show you something that could change your life and the lives of many other people." Victor looked at him suspiciously. "Kid, if you're selling something, I'm not interested." "I'm not selling anything. I'm offering something much more valuable, the chance to do what's right without risking it all alone." Miguel opened the folder, revealing organized documents, receipts, photos, and a list of names. "I know you were fired from the Golden Fork for reporting irregular payments. I know you agreed to work here because you needed the job, and I know you've probably noticed that this place operates in exactly the same corrupt way as your old job." Victor's face slowly transformed, turning from irritation to shock and finally to something resembling cautious hope. He looked around, checking if they were alone, and gestured for Miguel to enter. "You have 5 minutes," said Victor, "but if it's some kind of prank, I'll personally make sure you never go near this place again." What Victor didn't know was that those 5 minutes would turn into 2 hours of revelations that would confirm his worst suspicions about his new employer. And what Miguel didn't immediately reveal was that he had already secured Victor a letter of recommendation from 3 renowned chefs, all former Castellano employees who had also been unfairly fired, in case he lost his job for doing the right thing. Meanwhile, at the poker club, Richard Castellano laughed loudly at a joke about keeping the rabble out of real business, never imagining that the rabble kid he had humiliated was at that very moment building a trap so perfect that not all of his expensive lawyers could undo it. Carmen Torres, lying on her bed at home, held an old photo of herself in her Castellanos prime chef's uniform. Tears streamed down his face, but they weren't from sadness. They were from fierce pride at having raised a son who understood that justice isn't just about exposing the villain, but about building such a strong network of evidence and allies that the truth becomes inevitable. The second act of Venganza was silently assembling itself, each piece being positioned with surgical precision, each witness being carefully prepared, each document being meticulously checked, and Richard Castellano, in his blind arrogance, continued to underestimate that boy with torn sneakers who he had kicked out of his restaurant. After all, what could a 15-year-old candy salesman do against a multi-million-dollar empire? That question would be answered in such a devastating way that it would transform Miguel Torres from a forgettable victim into a local legend, and Richard Castellano from an admired businessman into a public example of how gratuitous cruelty can come back multiplied when directed at the wrong person, or rather, the right person. Victor studied the documents spread out on the table in his small room at the back of the restaurant for almost 2 hours. Each page revealed a pattern of corruption so systematic that it seemed impossible that Castellano had operated with impunity for so long. This, Victor pointed to a series of invoices, shows that he accepts meat past its expiration date and alters the dates in internal records. And here, he turned another page. Cash payments to health inspectors that coincide exactly with the dates of approved inspections. Miguel nodded. "My mother has seen this happen multiple times. When she tried to report it, she was fired and slandered. He uses the same pattern with everyone who threatens to expose him, accuses them of theft, destroys their reputation, makes sure they never work in the industry again." "And you collected all this yourself?" Victor asked, genuinely impressed. "You're 15. 15 years and 3 months of preparation," Miguel corrected. "Since the day I saw my mother cry because no one believed her. Since the day her health started to deteriorate because of the stress of being called a thief, when in fact she was the only honest person in that place." Victor closed his eyes briefly, as if he was making an important decision. When he opened them again, there was determination there. "What do you need from me?" "Access," Miguel said simply. "Once, to the second-floor office the next 2 Thursdays when he leaves for poker. I need 20 minutes of uninterrupted time." "What if we get caught?" "You have these 3 letters of recommendation." Miguel pushed envelopes across the table. "From chefs who worked under Richard Castellano and now run their own successful establishments. If anything goes wrong, you'll be guaranteed a job before you even have to look. I've already checked." Victor took the envelopes, opened one of them, and read it. His expression gradually changed from skepticism to something close to hope. "You really thought of everything." "I learned it from my mother," Miguel replied. She always said that justice is not luck. It's preparation meeting opportunity. The following Thursday, as Richard Castellano adjusted his expensive tie before heading out for his poker night, he had no idea he was leaving his empire in the hands of two conspirators who were about to carefully dismantle every layer of his illegal operations. Miguel entered the service gate at 9:45 p.m., carrying a discreet backpack. Victor guided him up the service stairs to the second floor, where Castellano's private office remained locked. With slightly shaking hands, Victor inserted the master key that had emergency access. 20 minutes, he whispered. After that, the security system automatically scans and records any movement in this wing. Miguel came in and immediately got to work. I wasn't there to steal. I was there to document. His backpack contained a professional camera loaned by James Sullivan, the journalist who had filmed his original expulsion. The office was exactly as Carmen had described. Perfectly organized files on one side, the official records, and a second set of locked drawers on the other. Miguel used techniques he had learned from watching online tutorials for months, combined with instructions Victor had provided on where Castellano hid his secondary keys. The top drawer revealed altered contracts, agreements with suppliers that showed values completely different from those recorded in the tax books. Miguel photographed each page, making sure to capture timestamps and details that would prove authenticity. The second drawer contained something even more incriminating, a handwritten notebook where Castellano recorded cash payments. It was his own handwriting, his own ink, dated and signed, a personal record of every bribe, every illegal deal, every threatened employee. Arrogant to the end, Miguel muttered, photographing each page. He keeps evidence against himself because he thinks he's untouchable. The third drawer almost made Miguel drop the camera. There was the complete dossier on his mother, including internal emails that proved the theft accusation had been fabricated. More than that, there were explicit instructions from Castellano to ensure that Carmen Torres never again works in any respectable establishment in this city. Miguel's hands shook when photographing those documents. Here was definitive proof of the deliberate destruction of her mother's life. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was calculated and systematic cruelty. 10 minutes, Victor's voice came from the hallway. Miguel worked faster, opening digital files on Castellano's computer. The man was so confident in his impunity that he didn't even use complex passwords. Within 5 minutes, Miguel had copied years of financial records onto an encrypted thumb drive. When he left the office exactly 19 minutes later, he was carrying enough evidence to not only prosecute Castellano, but completely destroy his reputation and empire. Every document photographed, every record copied, every piece of evidence meticulously catalogued. Victor followed him to the back exit, where James Sullivan waited in his car discreetly parked 2 blocks away. The journalist received a copy of everything immediately. "This is pure dynamite," James said, reviewing the photos on his laptop. "With this evidence, we can not only expose Castellano but trigger a full federal investigation. Tax fraud, bribery of public officials, violation of health codes. This man will lose absolutely everything." "Not yet," Miguel interrupted. "There's still one last piece I need to place before I detonate everything." In the following days, something interesting started to happen. Miguel went back to selling his candy, but this time strategically in front of Castellano's prime again, not at the door, but on the public sidewalk, where it was perfectly legal. He smiled at customers as they came and went, offered his candy politely, never invasive. Castellano saw him through the window on the third day and turned red with anger. He descended furiously, but this time there were crucial differences. First, James Sullivan was casually having dinner on the outdoor patio with his camera at the ready. Second, Miguel had discreetly informed the city's licensing department that he would be selling there, ensuring that he had full legal permission. "You!" Castellano shouted, pointing an accusing finger. "I said never come back here again." "Sir," Miguel replied with disconcerting calm, "I am on the public sidewalk with a valid street vendor license." He showed the official document. "I have every right to be here." The vein in Castellano's forehead was visibly pulsing. Customers began to observe the scene, some recording with cell phones. The businessman was about to explode publicly again, just as Miguel had predicted. "Your crap bullets are not welcome near my establishment," Castellano screamed, completely losing control. "You're a stain on this neighborhood." A what, sir?" Miguel asked softly. "Finish your sentence. Everyone is listening." Castellano noticed the cameras, the customers watching, the trap closing. He retreated, but the damage was already done. Another viral video showing his explosive temper and evident prejudice. That night, in the small kitchen of his apartment, Miguel finally told Carmen the entire plan. His mother listened in silence, tears streaming down her face. as her son detailed each step of the elaborate revenge he had concocted. "You didn't have to do all this for me," Carmen whispered, holding her son's hands. "It wasn't just because of you, Mom," Miguel replied. "It was for every employee he destroyed, every person he humiliated, every life he ruined because he thought power and money made him untouchable." He paused, his eyes meeting hers with a fierce intensity. "And because someone needs to teach men like him that underestimating the wrong people has consequences." Carmen pulled her son into a tight hug. "When will this happen?" "Tomorrow," Miguel said simply. "Tomorrow the whole world will know exactly who Richard Castellano is." As Castellano slept peacefully that night in his suburban mansion, dreaming perhaps of his next corporate expansion or his next lavish business dinner, he had no idea that a 15-year-old boy he had humiliated and expelled had spent the last 3 months meticulously building the most perfect trap of his life. A trap made not of anger or emotional revenge, but of patience, preparation, and a deep understanding that true justice is not served hot. It is served cold, calculated, and absolutely irrefutable. The pieces were all positioned, the allies mobilized, the evidence cataloged and ready as for publicity. All that was left was to pull the trigger and watch an empire built on cruelty and corruption crumble in real time. And Miguel Torres, the boy in ripped sneakers who sold candy to pay his mother's hospital bills, was about to teach a lesson that Richard Castellano would never forget if he lived professionally to remember. Tomorrow, justice would finally find its moment, and when it did, it would be devastating, public, and absolutely irreversible, because sometimes fate needs a little help from someone smart enough to turn humiliation into fuel, pain into strategy, and patience into perfect revenge. Friday dawned with a heavy sky over Chicago, as if the city itself sensed that something significant was about to happen. Richard Castellano arrived at his restaurant at 9 in the morning, as always, expecting another profitable and peaceful day in his gastronomic empire. What he didn't know was that that would be the last day he would enter that establishment as its owner. At 10 o'clock, James Sullivan published the first article in the Chicago Tribune. The title was devastating. "Empire of Corruption: How Chicago's Most Exclusive Restaurant Has Operated for Years in Violating Health and Labor Laws." The article was accompanied by clear photos of documents from Castellano's office, amended contracts, records of bribes, the handwritten notebook with each illegal payment noted in detail. Most importantly, it included the full dossier on Carmen Torres, proving that her dismissal had been deliberate retaliation for trying to report wrongdoing. Castellano was reviewing the lunch menu when his phone started blowing up with notifications. The first call was from his lawyer, his voice thick with panic. "Richard, we need to talk now. There's an article in the Tribune that—" "Jesus Christ, tell me that's not true. What the hell are you talking about?" Castellano opened the newspaper's website and felt his blood run cold in his veins. There, in the main headline, was his entire illegal operation laid out in painstaking detail. That's impossible. How did you get those photos? My office is locked." But the article was just the beginning. At 10:15, the Chicago Department of Public Health issued an emergency inspection order. 3 inspectors arrived at Castellano's Prime with warrants to thoroughly search the premises. This time, there was no way to bribe anyone. The media were already outside, cameras trained on the restaurant's entrance. Victor, the manager who had helped Miguel, calmly opened the doors and fully cooperated with the inspectors. He had spent the last few days meticulously documenting every irregularity he witnessed, and now he turned it all in with a perfectly organized folder. "Expired meat being repackaged with new dates here." Victor pointed to the cold room. "Cleaning products stored alongside fresh ingredients there. And if you check the temperature records versus the actual readings, you'll find systematic discrepancies." Castellano tried to intervene, his voice rising an octave. "You're fired. Get out of my restaurant now." "Actually," Victor replied with impressive calm, "I already handed in my letter of resignation yesterday, and I gladly accept Chef Martin's offer to manage his new establishment." He held up one of the letters of recommendation that Miguel had provided. "Unlike you, there are people in the world who value honesty and integrity." At 11 o'clock, the IRS arrived with search and seizure warrants. The second set of ledgers that Miguel had photographed had been anonymously handed over to tax authorities 3 days earlier, giving them enough time to launch a formal investigation. "Mr. Castellano," Federal Agent Morrison announced, "we have authorization to seize all financial records of this company, including computers, physical documents, and access to bank accounts. You have the right to contact your attorney." The restaurant was emptied of customers in a matter of minutes. News spread quickly. No one wanted to be photographed entering or leaving an establishment under federal investigation. Reservations for the coming weeks began to be canceled en masse. Castellano frantically called his political contacts, his business friends, anyone who could help him, but the Tribune article had made everything too toxic. No one wanted to be associated with him now. "Richard, I'm sorry, but I can't get involved in this," said Councilman Thompson, a longtime friend. "Federal tax fraud, bribery of public officials, you're alone in this." At noon, something even more devastating happened. Miguel Torres was interviewed live on TV El Local, directly in front of Castellanos Prime. The boy who had been publicly humiliated and expelled was now telling his story to the entire town. "My mother, Carmen Torres, worked as an assistant chef here for years," Miguel explained, his voice firm and clear. "When she attempted to report serious health irregularities, she was falsely accused of theft and fired. Mr. Castellano deliberately destroyed her reputation so that she would never again be able to work in any decent restaurant in this city." The reporter held copies of the documents. "And you have proof of that?" "I have internal emails from Mr. Castellano himself instructing employees to ensure that Carmen Torres never again works in any reputable establishment in this city." Those are his words. Miguel paused, his eyes meeting the camera directly. "He thought he could ruin my mother's life and then humiliate me in front of everyone for trying to earn honest money to pay her medical bills. He completely underestimated what a determined person can do when they have time, evidence, and the truth on their side." Inside the restaurant, Castellano watched the interview on one of the kitchen televisions, his face turning from red with anger to the pale gray of absolute panic. That damn kid with the ripped sneakers, had systematically destroyed his entire empire in a matter of hours. "How did you get all this evidence?" the reporter asked. Miguel smiled slightly. 3 years of preparation, every document checked, every witness contacted, every piece of evidence authenticated. When you suffer an injustice, you have two choices: accept it as a victim, or use it as fuel to ensure the truth comes out. I chose the second option. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ms. Margaret Chen gave a separate interview, confirming that she had witnessed suspicious conversations between employees about taking care of Carmen Torres the night before the alleged robbery. She produced receipts that proved she was at the restaurant on the exact date. Other previously fired employees began speaking out, emboldened by the public exposure. Stories of retaliation, intimidation, and illegal practices accumulated. What were once isolated suspicions were now revealed to be a systematic pattern of abuse that had lasted for years. At 3 o'clock, Castellano's minority partners called an emergency meeting and voted for his immediate removal as CEO of the restaurant chain. "You have become a catastrophic liability," declared Marcus Davidson, the largest shareholder after Castellano. "We're triggering the misconduct clause in the corporate agreement. You're out." "You can't do this," Castellano shouted, punching the conference room table. "I built this empire. This is my company." "It was," Davidson corrected coldly. "Now it's just the wreckage of what it used to be, and you're the reason it's burning. The lawyers will send you the papers. You have 24 hours to vacate your office." When Castellano finally left the building at 5 p.m., a small crowd had gathered outside. These weren't supporters. They were people he had harmed over the years finally seeing justice being done. Media cameras captured every second. Miguel was there, standing calmly on the sidewalk with his mother at his side. Carmen Torres, still fragile but finally able to leave the house, held her son's hand with pride visible in every line of her face. Castellano stopped short as he saw the two of them, his empire crumbling around him, his reputation destroyed, his future uncertain. The man who hours before was toasting champagne and laughing at rabble now found himself facing the same rabble who had orchestrated his complete downfall. "You," he whispered, pointing a shaky finger at Miguel. "You ruined my life." "No," Miguel replied calmly, his voice carrying a dignity that contrasted brutally with Castellano's desperation. "I just brought to light what you had been doing for years. You ruined your own life, Mr. Castellano. I just made sure everyone could see who you really are." Carmen squeezed her son's hand, tears streaming down her face, but they were tears of relief, of vindication, of fierce pride. "Justice is not revenge," she said softly, but loud enough for Castellano to hear. "It's simply the truth finally catching up with those who have tried to run away from it for too long." Castellano opened his mouth to respond, but there were no words, no argument, no threat, no justification that could undo what had been exposed. He got into his luxury car, one of the few possessions he still owned for now, and left without looking back. As the afternoon lights painted the Chicago sky with shades of orange and red, Miguel looked at the building that no longer belonged to Richard Castellano. 3 years of preparation. It was meticulous. 3 months of careful execution, and finally justice had been served, not through violence or cruelty, but through the devastating force of the well-documented truth. James Sullivan approached, turning off his camera. This is going to be a book, you know that? The story of how a 15-year-old boy overthrew an empire of corruption. Miguel shook his head. It wasn't me alone. It was each person he harmed choosing to finally speak out. It was Victor risking his job. It was Ms. Chen having the courage to testify. It was my mother teaching me that integrity is worth more than any amount of money. But as mother and son walked home that historic night, one question remained. What would their lives be like now? What would happen to Castellano in the following months? And most importantly, how would that act of justice transform not just two lives, but an entire community that has witnessed that sometimes, just sometimes, the right people win when they fight the right way? The answer would come in ways that not even Miguel, in all his meticulous planning, could have fully predicted. 6 months after Richard Castellanos' spectacular fall, Chicago had witnessed transformations that no one could have predicted that October morning when a 15-year-old boy was kicked out of a 5-star restaurant. Castellanos' Prime never reopened. The building sat empty for weeks until it was sold at auction for a fraction of its original value. Ironically, the person who bought it was a consortium of former employees led by Victor, the manager who had helped Miguel expose the corruption. They turned it into a cooperative restaurant called Open Table, an establishment that hired chefs from all backgrounds, especially those who had been unfairly marginalized by the industry. Carmen Torres was invited to be the executive chef. Your first decision? Create a mentoring program for young people from the outskirts interested in professional gastronomy. No one else will be stopped from following their dreams because of where they were born or who they know, she declared at the unveiling, tears of happiness streaming down her face as Miguel held her hand. Carmen's health improved dramatically. The donations that began pouring in after her story became public completely covered her medical debts and ensured the top-notch cardiac care she needed. More important than the money was the public vindication. Newspapers published retractions of the false theft accusations, and 3 different restaurants offered formal apologies for refusing to hire her based on rumors spread by Castellano. For years, I woke up every morning carrying the shame of a false accusation, Carmen said in an interview with the Chicago Tribune months later. My son gave me back not just my reputation, but my dignity. He taught me that justice isn't just about punishing those who did wrong. It's about rebuilding what was unjustly destroyed. Miguel became a surprising public figure. Schools invited him to speak about perseverance and strategy. Community organizations sought him out for advice on how to document injustices and seek legal redress. He even received a full scholarship to study law at a prestigious university, offered, interestingly, by Mrs. Margaret Chen, who revealed herself to be a board member of an educational foundation. When I saw that boy being expelled that day, I felt ashamed for my own inaction, Margaret explained during the scholarship award event. Miguel taught me that it's never too late to do the right thing, but it's infinitely better to do it early than wait for others to act first. James Sullivan won an investigative journalism award for the article that exposed Castellanos' corrupt empire. His reporting triggered a much larger investigation into illegal practices in Chicago's restaurant industry, resulting in health and labor reforms that benefited thousands of employees. Miguel Torres did the investigative work, James said upon accepting the award. I merely gave voice to what he had meticulously documented. As for Richard Castellano, his downfall was as complete as it was deserved. Federal investigations revealed years of tax evasion totaling millions in unpaid taxes. He was fined heavily and forced to sell virtually all of his possessions, including his suburban mansion, his luxury cars, and even his prized collection of rare wines. The chain's other restaurants were sold to pay off debts. His former partners sued him for breach of contract and mismanagement. Business friends who had once fawned over him now crossed the street to avoid him. The poker club he attended weekly quietly canceled his membership. But perhaps the most devastating consequence was the social one. Castellano became a public symbol of everything that was wrong with elitist corporate culture: the arrogance, the prejudice, the wanton cruelty disguised as standards of excellence. Memes circulated on social media showing her red-faced yelling at Miguel, accompanied by captions about karma and justice. He tried to rebuild his life in another city, but history followed him. Job interviews ended abruptly when employers recognized your name. Attempts to open new businesses failed when investors discovered their past. He had become untouchable, but for the opposite reason than he always believed he would be. A year after the incident, a journalist found him working as an assistant manager at a chain burger joint in a distant suburb, earning less in a month than he usually spent on a single bottle of wine. When asked if he had anything to say, Castellano simply shook his head and muttered, "I underestimated that kid. I underestimated what happens when you humiliate the wrong person." But this story isn't really about the downfall of Richard Castellano. It's about what happens when someone refuses the role of victim and decides to write a different ending. Miguel never boasted about his victory. He never gave interviews ridiculing Castellano or celebrating his suffering. When asked about revenge in his lectures, his answer was always the same. It wasn't revenge, it was justice. Revenge is emotional and destructive. Justice is strategic and reconstructive. On the night of the first anniversary of Mesa Aberta's opening, Carmen organized a special dinner. Present were Victor and his team, Mrs. Margaret Chen, James Sullivan, former employees that Castellano had harmed, and dozens of young people from the mentoring program. Miguel, now 16 and about to start university, stood up to make a toast. "A year ago, I was kicked out of a restaurant for trying to earn honest money to help my mother. Today, we are in this same building, but transformed into something much bigger than it was before. Not just a restaurant, but a symbol that ordinary people can overcome unjust systems when they have patience, preparation, and most importantly, when they refuse to accept that cruelty and prejudice are just the way it is." He paused, looking around the room full of smiling faces. "Richard Castellano tried to teach me my place. Instead, he taught me that there are no fixed places, only the limits we allow others to place on us. He tried to destroy my mother. Instead, he gave us the motivation to expose an entire system of corruption and build something better." The room erupted in applause. Carmen hugged her son, tears of pride flowing freely down her face. Later that night, while helping clean up after dinner, Miguel found Victor in the kitchen. "You know what's funny?" Victor said, washing the last dishes. "Castellano still thinks it was you who destroyed him, but it wasn't. He destroyed himself years ago with his own choices. You just made sure everyone could see what he really was." Miguel nodded thoughtfully. "My mother used to say that character is who you are when no one is looking. Castellano built an entire empire on cruelty he thought he could hide. In the end, it wasn't my evidence that destroyed him. It was simply the truth finally catching up with someone who had run from it for too long." As he walked home that night, passing the building that once housed Castellano's prime and now glowed the illuminated Mesa Aberta sign, Miguel thought about the lesson he would carry with him forever. The best response to injustice isn't anger or violence. It's strategy, preparation, and the steadfast refusal to accept that powerful people are above the consequences of their actions. Richard Castellano laughed at a boy selling candy because he thought privilege and money made him superior. Fate, with a little help from a determined teenager, a notebook full of evidence, and a community tired of injustice, made him cry as he proved that true strength doesn't come from how much you have, but how much you're willing to fight for what's right. And in the end, as Castellano worked at a diner trying to rebuild a life shattered by his own cruel choices, and as Miguel prepared to enter law school with a full scholarship and a life mission to fight systematic injustices, it was proven once again, underestimating people based on appearances, backgrounds, or circumstances is not just morally wrong, it's dangerously stupid, because sometimes that insignificant kid you kick out of your restaurant isn't a helpless victim. Sometimes he is a patient strategist NTE, who is carefully collecting every piece of evidence necessary to ensure that when justice finally comes, it is so complete and devastating that it rewrites not just individual lives, but entire systems. And that, in the end, is the most important lesson. True revenge isn't about destroying those who wronged you. It's about building something so meaningful and positive that their life becomes just an insignificant footnote in your story of overcoming. If this story of how patience, preparation, and strategic justice can overcome even the most powerful opponents has touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because in the real world, unlike in movies, villains are not defeated by heroes with superpowers. They are defeated by ordinary people who refuse to give up, who meticulously document every injustice, and who understand that true strength lies in turning pain into purpose and humiliation into motivation to create real, lasting change.